I ate a gas station sandwich alone in my car on Thanksgiving, parked outside a pharmacy with the heater running, because it was 38 degrees out, and I didn't have anywhere else to be. The parking lot nearly empty except for one other car near the entrance, its owner presumably inside picking up a prescription they'd forgotten they needed on a holiday. My mother had called 2 weeks earlier and told me not to come. She said I brought negativity into the house, that everyone needed a little peace this year, said it in the same brisk, decided tone she uses when she's already rehearsed a conversation before having it. I didn't argue. Arguing with my mother has always felt like charting a patient who refuses the reading. You note it, you sign it, and you move on. What none of them knew that night was that a neighbor's doorbell camera, 2 doors down, had picked up something through an open kitchen window while I was sitting in that parking lot, eating cold turkey out of a plastic container, watching my own breath fog the windshield. What I did after I heard that recording is the entire reason I'm telling you any of this. Welcome to Sweet Payback Stories. Tonight's story begins with a holiday spent alone in a car and ends with a family finally reckoning with exactly what they were trying to keep quiet by keeping me out of the room. My name is Audalis Ferreira. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a home health physical therapist, the kind of job where you spend your days in other people's houses, noticing the small things that tell you whether someone's actually doing well or simply performing wellness for the 15 minutes you're there to see it. I want you to hold on to that particular skill because it's exactly what let me see, once I finally had reason to look closely, everything my family had been quietly doing around my grandmother for months. My grandmother Constance is 86, sharp in conversation but increasingly unsteady on her feet, and for the past year and a half, I've been the one managing most of her actual day-to-day care, informally, without ever asking my parents to put anything about that arrangement in writing. I filled her pill organizer every Sunday, sitting at her kitchen table with the little plastic compartments lined up in a row, checking and double-checking against her prescription list, because I've seen, professionally, exactly how badly a missed or doubled dose can go for someone her age. I drove her to physical therapy appointments twice a week, on top of the sessions I ran with her myself at home, off the clock. Because that's simply what you do for someone who taught you to ride a bike in the same driveway I still park in every Sunday. I kept a small notebook by her recliner, tracking her appetite, her mood, which mornings she seemed foggier than others, a habit born entirely out of professional instinct, rather than anyone asking me to keep it. Nobody in my family ever asked me to do any of it formally. I just did it, the way you do things for people you love without waiting to be assigned the job. The ban came a week after I'd asked my mother a fairly simple question. I'd noticed, going through some of Constance's mail while helping her organize bills one afternoon, 2 unusually large withdrawals from her checking account, several $1,000s each, within the same month. I mentioned it to my mother on the phone that evening, casually the way you mention something you assume has a simple explanation. She got quiet, then brisk, then changed the subject entirely, and I let it go at the time, chalking it up to my mother's general discomfort talking about money. A week later she called and told me not to come to Thanksgiving. I want you to sit with that timeline the way I eventually had to. 1 week between a question about withdrawals and a sudden, vague accusation about negativity. I didn't connect those 2 things immediately. I connected them eventually, and once I did, I couldn't unsee it. I spent that Thanksgiving quietly, deliberately not making a scene about it, because making a scene has never really been in my nature, and because some tired, familiar part of me had already decided this was simply one more thing to absorb without complaint. I sat in my car outside a pharmacy that stayed open on the holiday, ate a sandwich that had clearly been sitting under a heat lamp too long, and drove home before it got fully dark, telling myself I'd figure out how to feel about it later. Later came faster than I expected. 2 days after the holiday, I got a text from Mrs. Okafor, my parents' neighbor 2 doors down, a woman I've known since I was small enough to ride my bike past her hedges, who used to keep a jar of butterscotch candies by her front door specifically for the neighborhood kids. "I think you need to hear something I picked up on my camera Thursday night," she wrote. I didn't know what to do with it. I called her within the hour, more confused than alarmed at first, sitting on the edge of my bed still in my work clothes. She explained, carefully, almost apologetically, that her doorbell camera had picked up audio, not video exactly, just sound carrying across the yard from my parents' kitchen window, which had apparently been cracked open that evening to vent the heat from the oven. "I wasn't listening in on purpose, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear how much it had clearly been weighing on her to even make the call. "I was just reviewing a clip from earlier that day, a package delivery, and it kept recording longer than I expected, and I heard your parents' voices, and something about it just didn't sit right with me. She hadn't meant to record anything private. It had simply been running the way it always runs, and something in what she'd overheard while reviewing an unrelated clip had bothered her enough to reach out. She sent me the audio file that same evening." I sat on my own couch, headphones in, hands wrapped around a mug of tea I never actually drank, and listened to my parents' voices, raised just enough to carry, arguing in a kitchen I'd eaten dinner in my entire life. My father's voice, tense, saying they needed to get the house listed before she has to move to memory care and before Odalie starts asking more questions. My mother's voice, quieter but no less clear, agreeing that they should handle it quietly, the way they'd talked about. I played that section back 4 times before I could fully process what I was actually hearing, my tea going cold on the coffee table in front of me. This wasn't an argument about holiday stress. This was a plan already in motion about my grandmother's house, and about making sure I stayed far enough away not to interfere with it. I called the elder law attorney the following morning, a careful, thorough man named Reuben, who had actually helped Constance choose 2 years earlier, back when we first set up her original estate paperwork together, the two of us sitting at her kitchen table going through options, while she made her preferences clear in her usual blunt, no-nonsense way. I asked him to pull the current status of her power of attorney, and what he found sent a cold, sinking feeling straight through my chest. The document had been recently amended just weeks earlier, removing me entirely as a listed care advocate and naming my father as sole agent, dated the exact same week I'd been banned from Thanksgiving. I want to be honest about how disorienting that discovery was. I hadn't been formally involved in Constance's care on paper, not once, in the entire 1.5 years I'd been doing the actual work of it. And now, with a single amended document, I'd been formally removed from a role I'd never officially held, erased from something I'd never had the legal standing to lose in the first place, which somehow made it worse rather than better. I asked Reuben to send me a copy of the amended signature page, and I sat with it beside a small stack of old birthday cards Constance had written me over the years, comparing her handwriting side by side under a good light at my kitchen table. It wasn't a dramatic difference, nothing you'd catch at a glance. But it was there, once I looked closely, a subtle shakiness in the new signature that didn't match the steadier hand in cards she'd written me even more recently than the document's supposed signing date. I photographed both side by side and sent them to Reuben, who agreed the inconsistency was worth examining further, carefully, professionally, not as an accusation yet, simply as a question that deserved a real answer. I spoke privately with one of Constance's regular home health aides the following week, a kind, observant woman named Patrice, who'd been with her for over a year. I asked her as gently as I could whether she remembered anything unusual happening around the date on that amended document. She didn't hesitate. "That was a rough stretch," she said. Her new blood pressure medication was giving her some confusion for a few weeks, real fogginess. Some mornings we adjusted the dosage not long after because of it. I asked if that had been recorded anywhere, and she confirmed it had in the same care log I'd kept faithfully for over a year, sitting on Constance's nightstand exactly where I'd left it, plain, dated entries describing exactly the kind of cognitive fog that would matter enormously to anyone asking whether she'd fully understood a legal document placed in front of her that same week. I called Constance's bank next, with her own full knowledge and consent once I sat with her and explained, carefully, why I was asking. She held my hand the entire call, quiet, listening, occasionally squeezing my fingers at the parts that clearly upset her. The bank's fraud department confirmed that one of the large withdrawals I'd originally noticed had actually triggered an internal elder fraud review months earlier, flagged automatically by their own systems for being unusually large and inconsistent with her typical spending pattern. Nobody in my family had ever mentioned that review to me, or as far as I could tell to anyone else either. I confronted my brother Malcolm about all of this over coffee, choosing him deliberately over our parents first, because some part of me still hoped he might be a genuine ally rather than another quiet participant. Meeting him at a small cafe halfway between our two apartments, neutral ground for a conversation neither of us was fully prepared for. He wasn't entirely an ally, and he wasn't entirely complicit either, sitting somewhere uncomfortably in between the two. He admitted, uncomfortably, turning his cup slowly on the table, that he'd known about the plan to list Constance's house for weeks, that our parents had framed it to him as simply managing an inevitable, practical transition before her care needs became more expensive, something he'd gone along with because it sounded, on its surface, reasonable. They said it was just being practical, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Getting ahead of it before we're scrambling later. I didn't love the timing, but I didn't think it was, I don't know, sinister. I asked him if he'd known about the POA amendment specifically, and his face changed, genuine surprise crossing it for the first time in the conversation. No, he said slowly. I didn't know about that part at all. I told him about the audio, about the withdrawals, about the fraud review nobody had mentioned, watching each new piece land harder than the last. I didn't know how much of it was happening around her instead of with her, he finally said, staring at his coffee rather than at me. I should have asked more questions. I didn't want to be the difficult one either. I sat down with Constance directly after that, walking through the amended document together, page by page, watching her face as she tried to place the memory of signing it. Her recollection was foggy at best, genuinely uncertain, the specific kind of uncertainty that isn't performance or convenient forgetting, but a real gap in a week she simply couldn't fully account for. I remember your father brought some papers by, she said slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the document. I don't remember reading all of it carefully. I trusted him. He's my son. Watching her say that, watching her genuinely search for a memory that wasn't fully there, was harder than anything else in this entire ordeal. Reuben helped me file a formal concern with the state's long-term care ombudsman program, a resource neither Constance nor I had ever needed before, but one designed for exactly this kind of situation, a neutral, professional review of both the POA amendment and Constance's actual capacity at the time she signed it. I want to be clear that this wasn't an act of revenge. It was, as much as anything, an act of simply wanting an answer from someone with no stake in the outcome either way. I confronted my mother directly while that review was pending, sitting across from her at a coffee shop, rather than at the house, needing neutral ground for a conversation I already knew would be difficult. The same kind of cafe noise, milk steamers and low chatter, providing a strange, ordinary backdrop for what turned out to be one of the harder conversations of my life. She didn't come at me with anger. She came apart a little instead, her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from, admitting, her voice tight, that she and my father had panicked over the mounting cost of Constance's care, that waiting for a proper capacity evaluation felt, to them, like an unaffordable delay when decisions about the house felt urgent. Embarrassed that we needed to move fast, it felt easier to just handle it than to admit how behind we actually were. I didn't fully accept that explanation. I also understood, hearing it laid out plainly, that fear and convenience had blurred together into something neither of my parents had fully examined honestly before acting on it. The Ombudsman's review concluded several weeks later, finding sufficient concern about Constance's capacity at the time of signing to warrant reinstating her prior, properly executed power of attorney, the one that had named me as a formal care advocate alongside my father, pending a full medical capacity evaluation before any further changes could be considered. It wasn't a dramatic verdict. It was procedural, careful, unglamorous, exactly the kind of quiet, documented accountability that doesn't make for a satisfying movie scene, but matters enormously in an actual person's life. With the prior POA reinstated, decisions about Constance's house and her living situation slowed down considerably. guided now by an actual medical evaluation and by Constance's own clearly stated wishes, rather than a rushed, quietly managed timeline nobody had bothered to include her in. The house didn't get listed. Constance stayed exactly where she wanted to stay, at least for now, with a real documented say in what happens next. This year's Thanksgiving looked entirely different. I didn't go to my parents' table, and I didn't wait for an invitation that I now understood was never really about negativity in the first place. I hosted a small, quiet Thanksgiving at Constance's own house instead, at her own table, her at the head of it in the chair she's always preferred, the one with better back support, a hand-knitted cushion tied to the seat that she's had for as long as I can remember. I made her stuffing recipe from a card in her own handwriting, the ink faded but still perfectly legible, and the whole house smelled the way it always used to on holidays when I was small enough to sit on a phone book at that same table. Malcolm came, visibly uncomfortable in a way I found strangely reassuring, a man reckoning honestly with his own quiet complicity, rather than pretending none of it had happened, helping Constance cut her turkey without being asked, refilling her water glass twice without her having to say a word. My parents weren't there, an absence neither spoken about directly nor particularly mysterious to anyone at that table. Constance raised her glass at one point, looking around at the smaller, quieter gathering, and simply said, "This is nice," which from her, a woman never particularly generous with sentiment, felt like the loudest possible endorsement of exactly where we all were. I think about that gas station sandwich sometimes, eaten alone in a cold car outside a pharmacy, believing at the time, but I was simply the difficult daughter who'd finally worn out her welcome. I don't think about it with the same sharp hurt anymore. I think about it as the exact moment my exclusion from one holiday accidentally protected me from a plan I would have otherwise walked directly into without a single warning sign, and as the beginning of my grandmother finally getting a real, documented voice in decisions that were almost quietly made for her instead of with her. If there's someone in your own life being quietly pushed to the edges right as important decisions are being made without them, I hope this reminds you that the timing of an exclusion is sometimes the most important piece of information you'll ever get. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments, and if you believe patience, documentation, and quiet persistence can protect the people we love, even when we're the ones being kept out of the room, stay close, because Sweet Payback Stories has another one waiting for you very soon.